Yeah, that's right. The chronology is right. After the Fashion Story and Inside USA, I did the 54th Street Review.
The Fashion Story was for ABC, and it was in 1948, I believe.
1948, right. I think television was just starting to capture the world because, capture America because Burl started in 48. The fashion show lasted about 13 weeks, and somebody just sent me a tape of it. It's hysterically bad. But
Not a tape.
But we were cute. I showed it to Mel Brooks and Andy Bancroft. They loved it because it's a tape. I mean, somebody put it on tape.
Oh.
It was a kinescope originally, yeah. But somebody transferred it to tape and sent it to me.
So all your sins can't be hidden, huh?
No, but it's funny because when you're young and you got all your hair and you look different, and Andy Bancroft says, you're good, because I was singing on key. Now, you don't usually sing on key, but I was okay. But
that led to the 54th Street Review?
Well, I think so. Right after Inside USA, when that was over, they went on the road, and they were offering me to go on the road, and I didn't want to go on the road. As I was saying, money is interesting because of the way it is today. People are always interested in how much you make, how much did you make. When Herman Levin said, you don't ask for any more money, you're getting $250 a week, and those $250 a week, I saved money because we lived in Chicago for 6 months in a one-room hotel room with a Murphy bed and a little crib for Robbie. We saved all the money. We didn't go out. We ate at home, and I was home all day, just did the show at night. And when we opened in Chicago, Claudia Cassidy, who was the big reviewer in Chicago, had seen Call Me Mister in New York and hated it. And she wrote about it when we were coming from Detroit to Chicago. And we were coming with problems because our leading lady left. She was pregnant, and we didn't know it. And Marilyn Day replaced her. So we're coming into Chicago a little limping. And she didn't know that, Claudia Cassidy, but she wrote, don't bother coming to Chicago, I saw it in New York, we're not going to like it here. Well, we came to Chicago, and we were smashed, and I have never gotten reviews like that in my life. And she mentioned the fact that this young guy who took over, she went on and on and on, this much. And I'm thinking, I can't send it to Herman Levin, he's not going to give me any more money. But at that time, we had a lot of problems in the show. Buddy Hackett was acting up. He was always getting in problems with people. He was a funny guy. I love Buddy to this day, but he was always having fights with somebody. And people would get angry and say, I'm not rooming with him. I can't room with him. After a year on the road, and I had the dressing room downstairs. I had 17 changes, and I had guest dresses in the room. A couple of my actor friends wouldn't room with somebody else. So I wrote Herman in the letter, and I said, I'm not sending you reviews. You told me I'm supposed to get good reviews, but he knew that we were in trouble in Chicago because of Claudia Cassidy having written a piece on the Sunday before. And so, but I said, I'm not mentioning that, which I did. I'm not asking for any more money, but I think I should get extra money as this company psychiatrist because I was really the solid one in the company. One of the actors was so crazy, tore a phone out of the wall, tore a payphone out of the wall, threw it up the alley, hit another actor in the foot. It was, after a year, people do get a little crazy. It was about 7 months into the run. He sent me another $35. He did. He knew that the actress had left, and I was holding the show together by just being regular, steady.
You went to your second television series, which was the 54th.
Oh, yes. Right after the Inside USA, there was, between this Call Me Mr. and Inside USA was a real fallow period, about a year or 6 months, and nothing happened. After Inside USA, another little fallow period. But then I got an interview, and I got a job on the 54th Street Review that had a lot of good people. I think Fosse and Niles were, I'm not sure. No, they were on the shows. It was Russell Arms, who became a big singer in the hit parade. A comedian named Al Burney, EEO. He had a funny word connection stuff. Jack Sterling was on it, who was a big radio personality. And I was doing sketches.
This was for CBS, and it was in 1949, I believe.
For 1949, and CBS, and I was getting $125 a week, which is a nice salary if it came every week, and I was thinking we were going to be on for 12 weeks or something, 13. Anyway, at the same time, there was a show that George S. Kaufman was going to direct. Jerry Charteroff was going to do the sketches. Michael Kidd was going to do the dances. And there were going to be 4 major actors, Davy Burns, Lenore Lonergan, George Keane, and myself. They offered me the job. And I said, God, and it wasn't even Broadway. It was going to be a tryout. It was going to be a thing to be tried out called Pretty Penny. And I went to Larry White, I think. I don't know if it's the same Larry White at CBS, but his name was Larry White. And I said, I got to get out of this show. He says, you'll have a contract. I said, but it's Broadway. I said, it's Broadway. And look at that. I said, I'll pay my way out. You know, that was a big thing to say. That would cost me $125 a week for, I don't know, 6 or 8 weeks. He was very kind. He says, no, if you feel that way, you know, he says, go. And that show didn't last very long after that. And I went to Pretty Penny, which tried out in Bucks County and Westport, and didn't work. But we had some wonderful material, but it just didn't work. And again, I was left to my devices. The next thing that happened is a show called Alive and Kicking. And I'm told that when I did the 54th Street Review, Sid Caesar and Mel Brooks says he saw me in it. And they said, there's a guy who could work on our show, which I didn't know about. All I knew is that when I did the Alive and Kicking, I had one of the big roles in it. And
this was a Broadway show.
A Broadway show. It was going to be out of town for a few weeks, and it lasted 12 weeks, 6 out of town and 6 in New York. Bill Kitzel was the producer. And it was in trouble in Boston or wherever the heck we were. Yeah, Boston. And they called in Max Liebman, who was already had done the precursor, the forerunner to the show. Show was called the Saturday Night. What was it called? The Admiral Broadway Review.
Exactly.
Yeah, Saturday Night. The Admiral Broadway Review.
And it was on Saturday night.
It was on Saturday night, and it was a 13-week period. They went on for 13 weeks, but the following year they were going to go on an hour and a half and be the show of shows. And he offered me, he saw me in that show, and Max Liebman said, would you like to come on the show? And the show would last, after 6 weeks it was over, so I was available, and I went on to the show of shows.
Please put Max Liebman in perspective.
Max Liebman was the producer of the show of shows, and the only man, I think, in the country who could have, there were 2 men in the country who could do that kind of a show, a weekly Broadway review with songs, sketches, pieces of opera, ballet, modern dance, because he was the producer of the shows at Tamiment, another one of those adult places that I had worked in before. And we did the same thing. We did a different show. For 3 weeks, we did 3 different shows because 2 weeks, because people wouldn't want to see the same show if they stayed for a 3rd week. So you had to have at least 3 shows. So Max was equipped to do 3 shows. There was another guy called Ernie Glucksman at Green Mansions, who ultimately did the Colgate Hour, who knew about the review format. But Max Liebman had been at Tamiment with Danny Kaye and Imogen Coca and Jerome Robbins. He had a lot of great people. Neil Simon was a writer up there. And so he was equipped at least to do 3 shows in a row, but he ended up doing 39, and nobody ever believed that Sid Caesar could do a monologue every week for 39 weeks. Sid had 4 monologues that he did, one in Tars and Spars and one he did in the movie, and a couple others. But here it was with writers contributing, and they did it.
Had you met Sid Caesar prior to this?
I'd seen Sid Caesar in Tars and Spars and was so amazed at his talent. I said, wow. And then when I saw the Admiral Broadway Review, I said, and we saw it on a little 7-inch television set, an Admiral set that we had at home, this big, 10-inch, it was 10-inch, yeah. And I saw that show, and I said to my wife, I remember saying, that's where I belong. I belong on that show, because I was doing sketches, and that was the writing was so good and clever and sophisticated. And somehow I knew I would get on it. I didn't know how, when, I didn't try to get on it, but the luck of the Irish, Max Liebman came to be a play doctor on Live and Kicking, and invited me to come on.
He recruited you then?
He recruited me.
So then in 1950, you went over
in my first year of the full season of the show of shows, which is 1950 to 51.
In the beginning, did you have a major role to play in your show?
No, in the beginning I was really, they didn't know what they were going to do with me. They knew they were going to do sketches, and I would be in sketches. But they needed an interviewer for the professor and somebody who had good comedy timing. They had a guy who did it before who was a singer, and he was okay. But I guess if you have another comedian, most comedy teams, both people are funny. They just, one knows to keep quiet when the other one's working. And so I was really hired for that. And in those days, there were, in the early days of the shows, there were 3 writers to begin with: Mel Tolkien, Lucille Callan, and Mel Brooks came in as Sid hired him out of petty cash. No, Sid paid him, and then Max hired him out of petty cash. He was very young and obstreperous, but he came up with stuff that nobody believed. That, some stuff was so wild you couldn't do, but other stuff was so hysterical you had to do it. And slowly but surely, Max started adding writers like Joe Stein, who ultimately did Fiddler on the Roof and Zorba the Greek and Take Me Along and Plain and Fancy. Writers kept being hired, and by the time the first and second, even in the first year, we had more writers coming on to work. The Simon brothers, Doc Simon and Neil Simon, Danny and Doc, was Neil Simon and his brother Danny, and Tony Webster, a lot of...
Larry Gelbart?
No, Larry Gelbart came in when Sid was doing Caesar's Hour, but in those first 4 years, I think the people I mentioned were the main ones.
There was a story I had heard that Max Liebman had measured you to see if you were taller than Sid Caesar.
Oh, I don't need it. I was taller than him, but he didn't measure me.
Supposedly he said the straight man has to be
taller than a comedian. Oh, maybe so. I don't know. He didn't tell me that, but maybe that's one of the reasons he hired me. He says he's taller than him. But that's funny. I thought I was hired for my talent, but I was hired for my height.
What sort of man was Max Liebman?
Max Liebman was a very knowledgeable man. He knew everything about it. Very bright. He had written stuff with Sylvia Fine for Danny Kaye. In the early days, he'd helped write Sid some of his stuff. So he was a sort of a writer, producer, and he had good taste. He also had elegant taste. He loved opera, and we always had opera segments with Robert Merrill and Margaret Piazza. We always had those wonderful moments on the air where we actors could change clothes. We needed it.
Right.
But the first year, I remember being an actor, the first 3 weeks, and I wasn't used to being just an actor. When I did reviews, I was always involved with the writing, and here I wasn't hired as a writer, but I always wrote material for myself, and in the Army I wrote reviews. So I felt outside. And the writers split into 2 groups. One worked in Max Liebman's office. The other writers worked in the toilet. So Lucille Callan was with Max Liebman, and maybe Doc and Danny were in the toilet. And I was in the hall. There was no place for me to be. I'm in the hall. I said, I'm not going to spend my career in the hall waiting to be called in to read the sketches. So the 3rd week, I'll never forget it, the 3rd week, I really did get an idea that I thought would be very usable. I said, Sid was the greatest double talker that ever lived. He really is. Nobody can do double talk. Any language that he does, from Japanese, German, Italian, French, Spanish, Yugoslav, he's sensational. Polish. It's the best. And I did double talk in about 4 languages, 5 languages. And I said, but how am I ever going to use my double talk? I did it in my act. I used my double talk in my act. I said, I'll never use it. We were all in love with French movies and Italian movies in those days, The Bicycle Thief and, Open City, the Rossellini movies. And I came in one day and I said, why don't we do a foreign movie? Because we had already done a silent movie. And I said, why don't we do a foreign movie? And I remember them saying, how can we do a foreign movie? And I demonstrated by going over to Sid and selling him a cigarette or something in double talk and having an argument at the price. And it was hysterical. They were throwing in an English word every once in a while. I said, that's how we do it, And they said, it's wonderful. So from that 3rd week on, I was in the writer's room for the rest of the 9 years I was with Sid and Max and Sid.
You're suggesting that the facilities were very cramped. Where did you do your show shows?
Well, the show of shows originally, the show of shows was always done in it was called the City Center today. It was called the Mecca Temple before we got in. It turned into the City Center on 56th Street between 56th and 57th. And we had offices. Max Liebman had offices on the third, fourth floor, and a rehearsal room, and that was it. A big rehearsal room and a bunch of little. Max had an office, and there were a couple outer offices. There was not many places to hang. Most of the time, we were in Max's office from then on.
And this was live television.
This was
You were
live.
doing a lot of costume changes.
Oh yeah, a lot of costume changes. In those days, it was an hour and a half, and there were at least 4 to 5 comedy sketches a week. There would be the Commuters, which was the situation comedy sketch with the home life of the Victors. Sid and Imogene were one couple, myself and had many wives in those days, but Howie was a third couple when that's one of the shows. I mean, on Caesar's Hour, I think
Yes, the Commuters were
we
on
had the Commuters on
Caesar's
The other one were the Hickenloopers.
Right.
Yeah, the Hickenloopers were, and I think I was the Brewster. I don't remember what my name was, but we used to. There was that sketch. There would be a monologue for Sid. There would be a professor. There'd be a movie, and then there'd be either cliche or a pantomime where Imogene Coca and Sid would do 2 cliche talkers. You can say that again. They would just do talking cliches, and they were very funny. So we had about 7 or 8 forms to fill, and 4 or 5 would go on every week.
Would you have rehearsals?
Oh, yes. But as we wrote, we learned, as we wrote, and if something got put down, we'd already tried it on for size, so we knew it. And then we'd rehearse it. After Monday, we'd come in, decide what to do that week. Tuesday, and then we'd break into groups, 2, 2, and 2, or 3 and 4, and write either, the movies always had 2 or 3 writers. For the professor, it would be Sid and Mel Brooks and myself, and maybe another writer. And then we'd all come together on a Wednesday and see what everybody else. On Thursday, we'd put it on its feet and rehearse it. And on Friday, we'd show it to the camera director. And on Saturday, we'd go in early in the morning, 10 o'clock usually, and do the show 4 times. Once for blocking, the second time smoothly, hoping that we didn't have to stop too much. The third time was a dress rehearsal. And by the time 9 o'clock rolled around, it was the 4th time we did the show. We were pretty tired. An hour and a half show, and the dress rehearsal was in full dress, so you had to change. And as soon as you finished, you had about a half hour to make cuts. He said, no, it's too long. We got to cut this and this. And the sketches were always the things that cut. It was hard to cut a dance. You see, you'd have to cut not only the dance, but the music. So Sid used to get so upset. The jumping stays, but we had to learn the cuts.
Was the dress rehearsal before an audience?
No, it was before Carol Burnett. That was funny. We found out years later that Carol Burnett, who lived at the Studio Club, was a big fan of the shows, and she knew Sid's understudy, or sometimes Sid had to stand in when we rehearsed so he could see what it looked like. Milt Kamen invited Carol Burnett to see the rehearsals. She was dying to see how the rehearsal went, and then she'd go home and see how it was on the show. She said she actually had tickets to My Fair Lady once, but had to go to see from what the changes were from dress rehearsal to air, and she was cutting her teeth because the next best review form was taken over by her. Nobody else was doing it.
Please explain who Milt Kamen was.
Milt Kamen was a comedian who was so funny, and he looked a little like Sid. He had his own kind of humor. He was a French horn player, and I went to see him once, and he was so funny, and I loved him as a person. He was just a nice guy. And when Sid got the idea that he would like to see, after the second year of Caesar's Hour, he'd like to see what the sketch looked like without him. It was unnecessary, but he wanted to do that anyway. So we had a guy doing his part, and we used to use the rehearsals to invent. And when Sid was there, we'd always be inventing. So the shows were suffering from a lack of extra invention. So I said, let's get a comedian, a real good comedian. This guy was a nice comedian, but he was not an inventive comedian. So I said, let's get Milt Kamen, and So Milt came and rehearsed Sid's part, looked a little like him, and Milt was very creative and threw a lot of lines and ideas in while we were rehearsing the blocking 2 times, and Sid would do the dress rehearsal. So by that time, we got a lot of extra stuff. That's who Milt Kamen was.
Milt Kamen did very funny movie reviews.
Yeah, he became a very famous movie reviewer for network talk shows.
Who was the real boss? Was Sid the boss, or was
Sid was the boss.
Not Max?
No, Max was the boss when Max and Sid were together. When Milt Kamen came on, that was Caesar's Hour. After 4 years of your show of shows, it was getting to be top heavy. By that I mean everybody had to go someplace. Sid was getting a lot of money. Max had ideas of doing other things that Sid wasn't interested in. Sid wasn't interested in so much dancing and jumping, is what he called it, and music. He wanted more sketches. Max always wanted a 4 or 5 minute, 6 minute, 7 minute sketch. Sid wanted to do half-hour sketches, like we did a couple of movies, real long movies where we had a break in the middle, in the commercial and come back to the movie. Blast Video Theater, and it was a lot of stuff that Sid wanted to do, and he's being constrained by
Max.
Not by Max, but by the show that Max wanted to do. So when 4 years came, and the ratings were down a little now too, so the network was happy enough to break it into two. Max Lieden did a series of specials called Spectaculars, where he did an operetta. He could do anything he wanted, and they were rather good, but they were not basically comedy. And Sid now had his way and could start to do bigger, longer sketches.
Was Sid intimidating, as muscular as he is?
No, he was a benign despot. I mean, but we knew that you couldn't talk him into anything. If he didn't think a thing was funny, once in a while we'd talk him into something, and if you didn't make it, he'd give you such a look he would wither you. But most of the time, he was a writer in the room, and so everything that went into the paper, if he didn't like it, he would shoot it out of the air with an imaginary machine gun.
Why couldn't Sid operate outside of character? He always had a problem with that.
Sid, you'd have to go to his psychiatrist and ask him that. But I think Sid was most comfortable in character for a long time. You want me to give you a cheap analysis? He wasn't handled right as a kid by his parents and his brothers. They called him, he told me this once, he said my middle name was Shtick Dreck. And he was the youngest, and he didn't get a lot of attention. And so he didn't develop those social skills that most people have, but he could act the social skills. He could become Cary Grant if you wanted. If you said you're now doing a Cary Grant movie or you're doing Marlon Brando, give him a character. It's like the clown who can't be funny unless he puts the clown face on. But he was more than just a clown. He was a great acting comedian.
Tell us about Imogene Coca, please.
Well, Imogene Coca was, I consider her one of the strongest human beings I've ever seen. Frail little thing. She worked harder than any of us, because not only was she doing sketches, she was doing musical numbers and dances with Jimmy Starbuck, and she loved that. She was not a failed ballet dancer, but she did have ballet as a kid, and she could dance, really dance. And so she was working very hard, and she and Sid never talked to each other hardly. They liked each other, but they were both so shy until they got into their material, and then they used to scream and yell and then be quiet. They, very good, very good. It was a wonderful screen marriage. I mean, television marriage. But they were two shy people who would never made it outside of the theater.
Was it just a coincidence that you became reunited with Howie Morris again?
Oh, that was a coincidence. Howie Morris but 3 times we worked together, 4 times in the Army, radio, and then Call Me Mister was another thing. There was a fellow playing his part in Call Me Mister on the road. It was a small part, but it was a couple of good scenes, and the guy wasn't cutting it. And they wanted to get rid of him. And they said, you know anybody who's short guy? I said, yes, Howie Morris. So Howie Morris was on the road for us with Call Me Mister. Now, when they did, I think, Saturday night, the Admiral Broadway Review, they had a sketch where they needed a little guy so Sid could hoist him up and hang. So he was hired. And Howie was hired when we needed a little guy every week. 3 when they needed him. He was hired, and after the first year or so, then they put him on staff.
But certainly his talent is more than just being a little guy.
Oh, of course. He did some of the most brilliantly.
What's his strengths? What is Howie Morris's strength?
Well, first of all, he had wonderful accents. His German accent was as good as anybody. And that little thing he did with it was classic, with the dressing of a doorman, which you think is a general. He's dressing with a, Ungerschweiter Spritz. Howie was a good actor. He played Laertes. He was a real actor. If you put him in a part, he would act the part. If it was a sketch, he knew what to do with it.
I'd be remiss to leave, if I've made a leave your shows and not ask you what you must have been asked many times. What was your favorite sketch? In
the show of shows? Yeah. I used to say to Sid every week, what are you doing the show for this week? We always had one sketch or one thing in the show that was worth coming to work for. And usually it was either the movie, a foreign movie, and it would please us. We knew we'd be pleased to do it and knew that it also would work in an audience. It was usually one of those foreign movies. I did one sketch that John Gavin, our former ambassador to Mexico, every time he sees me, he says, "Dash Prancer." It was a sketch that I remembered fondly, and I was so happy that there was another person. It was where I was a very big movie star who wore tails all day long. In the afternoon, he wore leopard tails, and he was a homewrecker. Sid was married to, I think it was Nana Fabre at the time. I'm not sure. I think so. And he finally finds out that I'm cuckolding him with his wife, and we're going to have a massive fight, and we said we can't do a fight, a live fight, a real one that looks good. But the joke was that we wrecked the whole house, and at the very end there's nothing standing. Every picture, every piece of statuary is down, couches are tumbled over, and he says homewrecker, So that was the joke. And I said, well, hit me once, just hit me, make believe you hit me, And I ricocheted. I ricocheted up the stairs, down the stairs, and it was my favorite thing because I was using one punch. The centrifugal force of that punch sent me up the stairs, knocking over furniture, and finally there was he said, you missed that one. One left. I knocked over a statue.
Was the professor the precursor to the 2000-year-old?
Oh, absolutely. Mel was the biggest contributor to the professor because he came up with a lot of wonderful jokes for that. And the precursor to the 2000-year-old man happened, the 2000-year-old man happened in the first year of the show of shows, where I came in one day and I turned to Mel, who always was funny. He used to do his tapping.
Now you can keep going for a little while.
Yes? Yeah, the first time we did the 2000-year-old man was in Max Lieben's office in 1950, sitting on the couch. I had come in from seeing We the People Speak with Dan Seymour, which was a television show. And on the television show, a man says, I was actually in Stalin's toilet, and I heard Stalin say, we're going to blow up the world Thursday. I said, this is the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. If it's true, tell America. Don't tell America, tell the president. So I came in that day incensed that what I heard on the air was obviously made-up thing, and I said, here's a man who was actually at the scene of the crucifixion 2,000 years ago. Isn't that true, sir? Using head of J. Walter Thompson, Dan Seymour. I used his voice, and Mel answered, and the 2,000-year-old man was born that moment.
Let's pause here.